arcs that we looked at. Right? Remember vertical, horizontal. Can you look at this? Oh, I'm sorry. Never paid attention. Okay, back to these two arcs, these two paths. What I'm just suggesting, this is what we can take from the map informing us as we go on to develop ourselves into these hopefully beautiful, unique self-leaders, is that we have this simultaneous path. And it goes by several names. We've used most of these names. I'm just going to throw those up here real quick so we're on the same page. Okay? I'll put them all up and look at. Vertical, levels, structures. It's a process of becoming. It's a process, as we saw this morning, of developing perspective-taking abilities. It's a process of becoming more and more full. Full of what? Full of life, full of what's arising, aware of it in its entirety. And it's a process, as we said in the first day, of growing up. And it takes time. On the horizontal side, on the state side, on the stillness side, the correlate pairs here are being as opposed to becoming. And presence, as we talked about earlier, as opposed to perspective. Both getting cultivated simultaneously. Freedom. Freedom from exclusive identification with your ego. Freedom from Buddhist sense suffering. Freedom in a more theistic sense in the way of freedom to be looking out from the inside, the face of God. And kind of tritely, it's just all about waking up simultaneously together, those two paths. This is, what I'm suggesting is the ongoing path of us as integral leader wannabes. Integral leader aspirants, as we're aspiring to embody our unique self. Okay? So on these two paths, there's basically a flow. I'm going to spend too much time on this. Let's get into the review just quickly. In the presence arc, which again is the states, our ability to be, our developmental capacity to be aware of phenomena, gross phenomena, subtle phenomena, causal phenomena, not dual, that we spoke about before. In a leadership context, I want to throw out a challenging word and call it charisma in its fullest manifestation. Fully, non-dually awakened to your unique self brings about this crazy sort of spiritual charisma. Charisma is a tricky word because it's oftentimes associated with the ego. But again, think of the person you brought to mind and see if you can find a place of resonance with the idea of this crazy spiritual charisma. This magnetism that just opens people in your wake as you're present. That charisma coming down this arc informs a vision. And not so much here talking about a vision for your organization, but a vision for you in your life. Your personal mission. Another way to kind of hold it. But it's a vision for you as a leader doing the work you do in your life. That then relies on or descends into awareness. To be able to actualize that vision, you need to have really finely tuned and spacious awareness of what it is that's going on around you. You need to have an awareness of the intersubjective fields in as much of the moments of your life as you can. You need to have an awareness of the perspectives that you're taking, what information you're getting about yourself and about others in the moment. Why? So you can turn that hyphen into God. It all stems from awareness. And again, this isn't in the state kind of arc. This in some sense is a process of that contemplative path. From that place, then it can descend down into action. It kind of squeezes its way back down into gross material world, and boom, we can put that love, that light, into action. Churchill didn't sit on his ass. Neither did Mandela. And neither did probably most of the other people that you brought to mind. There's a huge action component to it. suggesting on the second arc, on the, oops, forgot I was doing that. On the second arc, this just goes back up the spiral. The vertical development. Okay. Action needs to be, can be, and does influence and fuel awareness, which can and does and will influence vision, which again can culminate as your embodied dual center of gravity self, spiritual leader charisma. So it's just two sort of broad brushstrokes, two ways of looking at this in the context of leadership. I meant to start with an apology. This session got shorter than it was before, so I skipped the debrief I wanted to do about the perspective taking exercise. So sorry for that, and hopefully we'll return to that in some manner throughout the week. I also want to touch on a piece that we left over from the first day. It was one of the questions I ended with, where I asked folks if they had a sense, an actionable sense, of where they were developed to on the stage spectrum. And most everyone raised their hand that they didn't know. So I want to touch on that real quick. Okay? It's part of this presence arc, so as far as this presentation goes, plug it in there. But I also want to just, in general, for this week, it seems to be an important sort of thing. I don't want to leave you with that sort of question, because in actuality, it's not nearly as hard to identify that in a functional, actionable sense as you think it is. The reason it seems like it's hard to identify is pretty simple. It's because I spent a whole bunch of time talking to you about what gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual phenomena work. And when you start by describing that stuff, first off, when you get to non-dual, it's like you can't talk about it, because if you do, that's not it. It has to be experienced. There's your first problem. Second problem is you think that to get a solid sense of where you are, you have to understand why and how that is, rather than more feeling into it. Okay? So just really briefly, the best ways. I had the same question. I had the same question up until very recently, actually. And I spoke to Ken and I said to him, I said, how do we know, now that we have this new map and we're working to apply it, how do we know, how do we identify where we are on the spiritual path, on this stage path? The first thing he said, which is true, is the only way to really know is to be in the presence of a spiritual teacher and to be guided by a spiritual teacher. In so many ways, that's a spiritual teacher's job. Take you along the path. So if you got one, get him into this sort of framework if you want to use that to kind of understand things. Good luck there. If you need help, give us a call. And if not, yeah, you can go find a spiritual teacher. If you go run up to him and say, hey, I need to figure out where I am on Wilbur State spectrum, they're going to look at you kind of funny. So that's not the only answer. But I do want to say that is probably the most accurate way to approach it. The other way to approach it is just some introspection. Okay? Every moment, this is called let me frame this up like this. Before we spoke about the moment-to-moment unfolding of both of these spectrums, we spoke a little bit about that as perspective taking in the moment this morning, and that's the vertical arc. On the horizontal side, the moment-to-moment unfolding of those states looks like this. Okay? In every moment, as a perception, a phenomena, an object, anything that we perceive arises, it arises as not two, not separate from everything else. In every moment, non-dual suchness is. So I call it present. You're like, well, shit, if it's arising in every moment, how come I'm not experiencing with every perception non-dual? How come when I look outside and I see the tree, why does it feel like Clint looking at the tree, and rather than I see the tree sees itself?